The phone screamed through my apartment at 3:17 a.m., cutting through 3 years of silence like a blade through bone. I'd changed my number twice since they'd thrown me out, but somehow, desperation always finds a way. My mother's voice cracked through the speaker, raw and broken in a way I'd never heard before. "Emma, please, Tyler's dying. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do, but I know you'd know what to do. I'm begging you." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years. 3 years since they'd stood in their pristine kitchen and told me I was no longer their daughter. 3 years since my father had pointed toward the door and said those words that still echoed in my chest every night before I fell asleep. "We don't need you anymore, Emma. We never needed the kind of daughter who destroys good people's lives." But Tyler, my baby brother who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who taught me to skateboard in the Walmart parking lot, who'd cried when I moved out for college because he thought I was abandoning him. Tyler was 19 now, and according to the woman who'd erased me from family photos, he was dying. I was already pulling on scrubs when she gave me the address: Millbrook General Hospital, Emergency Room Bay 3. The same hospital where I'd once been the youngest paramedic in the county's history, where I had saved more lives than I could count, where I'd made the choice that cost me everything I thought mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were calling me back to the place where my exile had begun. The October air bit through my jacket as I drove through empty streets that knew me by name once upon a time. Millbrook County had been my whole world for 25 years. Every corner held a memory, every building a piece of who I used to be before I became the daughter who chose truth over family loyalty. Main Street was still lined with the same shops that had sponsored my high school track team. The diner where I'd had my first job still glowed with fluorescent warmth against the darkness. Nothing had changed, except me, and the fact that I was no longer welcome in the place that had raised me. My hands trembled against the steering wheel as I pulled into the hospital parking lot, not from fear, but from the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergencies. It was the same feeling I'd chased for 7 years as a paramedic, the electric clarity that descended when someone's life hung in the balance. I'd missed this feeling more than I'd missed my family, and that realization made my chest ache in ways I wasn't prepared for. The automatic doors of the emergency room whooshed open, releasing the antiseptic smell that had once been as comforting as my mother's perfume. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of urgent white that made every face look ghostly. I approached the nurse's station, my footsteps echoing in the hollow quiet that hospitals wore in the early morning hours. "I'm Emma Walsh," I told the nurse behind the counter. She was young, maybe 23, with purple scrubs that had seen better days. "I'm here about Tyler Mitchell in Bay 3. She looked up from her charts, and I saw recognition flicker across her features. In a town like Millbrook, everyone knew everyone's business, and mine had been front-page news 3 years ago. "You're the paramedic who—" she started, then caught herself. "I mean, yes, Bay 3, but you should know the family specifically requested that only immediate relatives—" "The family called me," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the bitter laugh that wanted to escape. "I am immediate family. I'm his sister." The walk to Bay 3 felt like walking through molasses. Each step carried the weight of 3 years of exile. 3 years of wondering if I'd made the right choice when I'd blown the whistle on Dr. Franklin Morrison's prescription drug scheme. Franklin had been my father's best friend for 30 years, Tyler's godfather, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and had given me my first stethoscope when I'd graduated from EMT training. He'd also been selling opioid prescriptions to dealers for 2 years, flooding Millbrook County with enough pills to fuel an epidemic that was killing kids I'd gone to high school with. I'd found the evidence during a routine call when Franklin had accidentally left his prescription pad in the ambulance. I'd seen the quantities, the fake patient names, the pattern that painted a picture so clear it made my stomach turn. I turned him in because I'd taken an oath to do no harm, and Franklin's greed was harming everyone I'd grown up loving. My parents had seen it as betrayal. Franklin had lost his license, his practice, his reputation. My father had lost his best friend, and I had lost my family. The curtain around Bay 3 was drawn shut, but I could hear voices inside. My mother's whispered prayers, my father's gruff attempts at comfort, and underneath it all, the steady beep of machines that were keeping my brother anchored to this world. I took a breath that felt like swallowing glass and pulled the curtain aside. Tyler looked small against the white hospital sheets, smaller than the gangly teenager I remembered who'd grown 6 inches in his senior year and couldn't stop tripping over his own feet. His face was swollen beyond recognition, purple and yellow bruises painting a map of trauma across his features. Tubes snaked from his nose and mouth, and the ventilator beside his bed hissed with mechanical precision. His left leg was elevated in traction, but I could see from the angle that the break was compound, probably requiring multiple surgeries. My mother sat in a plastic chair beside his bed, holding his hand with both of hers. She looked older than her 58 years old, her hair gray where it used to be brown, her face lined with worry that went deeper than this single night. My father stood behind her, his factory supervisor's hands clasped in front of him, unsure what to do with themselves in a place where taking charge meant nothing. They both looked up when I entered, and for a moment we were frozen in a tableau of family dysfunction. 3 years of silence stretched between us like a chasm, filled with all the words we'd never said and all the forgiveness we'd never offered. My mother's eyes filled with tears that she'd probably been holding back since the call came in. My father's jaw tightened in that way it always did when he was fighting emotions he didn't know how to name. "Thank you for coming," my mother whispered, and her voice carried the weight of every birthday card she hadn't sent, every Christmas morning I'd spent alone, every milestone she'd let pass unmarked, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that she might have been wrong.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Moved to Tyler's bedside, my trained eyes scanning the monitors and machines with the automatic assessment that came from years of emergency medicine. His vital signs were stable but concerning. Blood pressure too low, heart rate too fast, oxygen saturation hovering at the edge of acceptable. But it was the neurological monitors that made my blood run cold. The intracranial pressure readings were climbing, and the sedation levels suggested they were keeping him under for more than just comfort. "What happened?" I asked, my voice professional and detached in the way that helped me function when emotions threatened to overwhelm clinical thinking. My father cleared his throat, the sound rough with exhaustion and something that might have been guilt. "Car accident. Head-on collision with a drunk driver on Route 9. Tyler was coming home from studying at the library. The other driver walked away without a scratch." I nodded, filing away the information while my hands automatically checked Tyler's pupils with the penlight I always carried. Sluggish response in both eyes, but equal. That was something at least. "How long has he been here?" 18 hours, my mother said. "They did surgery on his leg, but they said the head injury—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. "They said the swelling in his brain isn't responding to medication. They want to do another surgery, but Dr. Hayes said the risks are too high. She said we should think about—" She couldn't say the words, but I knew what Dr. Victoria Hayes had suggested. I knew Victoria from my paramedic days, knew her reputation for being more concerned with hospital liability than patient outcomes. She was the kind of administrator who saw lawsuits in every aggressive treatment, who preferred the safe option even when safe meant giving up. "I want to see his scans," I said, reaching for the chart at the foot of his bed. "You can't," my father said quickly, his voice carrying that edge of authority he'd used when I was 17 and trying to stay out past curfew. "You're not his doctor. You don't work here anymore." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. I turned to look at him, this man who'd taught me to change oil and throw a curveball, who'd been so proud when I'd graduated from EMT training that he'd kept my certification framed in his office. He couldn't meet my eyes, and I realized that calling me here hadn't been his decision. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't work here anymore. I don't work anywhere in this county anymore because you made sure of that when you decided that Franklin Morrison's friendship was more important than the kids he was helping to kill." My mother flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Emma, please, not now. Not here." "When, then?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. 3 years of suppressed anger and hurt bleeding through my professional composure. "When would be a good time to talk about the fact that you chose a drug dealer over your own daughter? When would be convenient to discuss the fact that you disowned me for doing the right thing? You destroyed a good man's life," my father said, his voice low and dangerous. "Franklin made a mistake, yes, but he didn't deserve to lose everything. He had a family, Emma. He had kids to put through college." "And the kids who died from his pills?" I shot back. "What about their families? What about Marcus Webb, who started with Franklin's pills and ended up shooting heroin behind the high school gym? What about them, Dad?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythm of Tyler's ventilator. We stood there, 3 adults who'd once been a family, surrounded by the wreckage of choices that couldn't be undone. I looked at my brother, so young and vulnerable in that hospital bed, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over my shoulders. "I need to see his scans," I said again, but this time my voice was calm, professional. "I need to understand what we're dealing with here." "We?" my mother asked, hope flickering in her voice like a candle flame in wind. I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I walked out of Bay 3 and headed toward the nurse's station. The young nurse in purple scrubs looked up as I approached, and I could see the curiosity in her eyes. Everyone in this hospital knew my story, knew what I'd sacrificed to expose Franklin Morrison's crimes. "I need you to page Dr. Marcus Bennett. Tell him Emma Walsh needs to speak with him urgently about a patient in Bay 3. She hesitated, glancing around as if looking for permission from someone with more authority. "Dr. Bennett is in surgery, but I could page him anyway," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of making life and death decisions in the back of ambulances. "Tell him it's about Tyler Mitchell and that Emma needs a favor." Marcus Bennett and I had worked together for 4 years before everything fell apart. He'd been the emergency room physician who'd backed up my decision to report Franklin Morrison. One of the few people in the hospital who supported me when the administration had tried to bury the investigation. We dated briefly after my exile from the county, but the shadow of my exile had made any relationship impossible. Good men didn't want to be associated with the woman who'd destroyed Millbrook's favorite doctor. 20 minutes later, Marcus appeared in the hallway outside Bay 3, still wearing surgical scrubs with his mask hanging loose around his neck. He was 36 now, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many difficult decisions. He'd been handsome in an understated way when we'd worked together, but the years had given him a gravity that made him seem older than his age. "Marcus," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that I'd forgotten existed. "I heard about Tyler. I'm sorry." "I need to see his scans, Marcus. Something isn't right here." He glanced toward Bay 3, where my parents were still keeping their vigil. "Victoria Hayes specifically instructed that you were not to be given access to any medical information. She said family dynamics were complicated." I almost laughed at the understatement. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. But Tyler is my brother, and if there's something that can be done for him, I need to know what that is. Marcus studied my face for a long moment, and I could see him weighing hospital policy against whatever history we'd shared. Finally, he nodded toward a small conference room down the hall. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you without causing problems for both of us. The conference room was cramped and windowless, with a computer terminal that Marcus used to pull up Tyler's medical records. The scans appeared on the screen in black and white and gray, revealing the intricate architecture of my brother's injured brain. I leaned forward, my trained eyes automatically cataloging the damage. The initial impact had caused significant swelling in the frontal lobe, but that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. There was something else, something that didn't fit with the trauma pattern I'd expect from a car accident. The hemorrhaging was wrong, the location too specific, the damage too targeted. "Marcus," I said slowly, pointing to a dark area on the scan. "This bleeding pattern, it's not consistent with blunt force trauma." He looked where I was pointing and I saw his expression change. "You're right. I noticed that too. But Victoria said..." "Victoria said what?" "She said the neurosurgeon in Pittsburgh reviewed the scans and confirmed that the injuries were consistent with the accident report. She said aggressive treatment would be futile and potentially harmful to the hospital's resources." I stared at him, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in my mind. Pittsburgh? Why would they send scans to Pittsburgh when Dr. Jennifer Kane is one of the best neurosurgeons in the state, and she's right here in Millbrook? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful. Dr. Kane was unavailable. Victoria said there was a conflict of interest. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. I thought about the accident report, about a drunk driver who'd walked away unharmed while my brother lay fighting for his life. I thought about Victoria Hayes and her concern for hospital liability. I thought about 3 years of exile and the network of protection that had surrounded Franklin Morrison until I'd torn it down. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me the way you did 3 years ago." He met my eyes, and I saw the same resolve that had made him stand up to hospital administration when they tried to silence me. "What do you need?" "I need you to run a tox screen on Tyler's blood. Full panel, including any substances that might not show up on a standard test. And I need you to do it quietly, without going through official channels." "Emma, what are you thinking?" I looked back at the scans on the computer screen, at the damage that didn't make sense, at the pattern that spoke of something more deliberate than a random accident. "I'm thinking that some people in this town haven't forgiven me for what I did to Franklin Morrison, and I'm thinking that hurting Tyler might be their way of making sure I understand that I'm still not welcome here." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus stared at the screen, and I could see him processing what I was suggesting. In a town like Millbrook, where everyone knew everyone's business and grudges could last for generations, revenge was a currency that never lost its value. "If you're right," he said quietly, "then we're not just dealing with a medical emergency, we're dealing with attempted murder." I nodded, my mind already moving to the next steps, the next questions that needed answers. And if I'm right, then Tyler isn't going to get better until we figure out exactly what they did to him and who's been covering it up. Outside the conference room, I could hear the normal sounds of a hospital in the early morning hours. Phones ringing, footsteps in the hallway, the distant chime of elevator doors. But underneath it all, I could feel something else. The weight of secrets, the pressure of lies told to protect the wrong people. The familiar sensation of standing at the edge of a truth that powerful people didn't want exposed. I'd been here before. 3 years ago, when I'd discovered Franklin Morrison's prescription scheme. I'd stood in rooms like this one looking at evidence that painted a picture of corruption and betrayal, knowing that speaking the truth would cost me everything I thought I needed. I'd lost my family then, lost my career, lost my place in the community that had raised me. But Tyler was lying in Bay 3 with damage to his brain that didn't make sense. And my parents had called me because they knew, somewhere deep down, that I was the only person who could save him. Not because I was the daughter they'd disowned, but because I was the woman who chose truth over comfort, justice over loyalty, doing what was right over doing what was easy. I looked at Marcus, this man who'd stood by me when it mattered, who'd risked his own career to support mine. "Will you help me?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes. But Emma, if we're going down this road, you need to understand that it's not going to end with just Tyler getting better. If someone tried to hurt him to get to you, then they're going to try again when they realize we're asking questions." I thought about my parents sitting beside Tyler's bed, holding vigil over the son they'd never had to choose between loving and protecting. I thought about the 3 years I'd spent in exile, learning to live without the approval of people who'd raised me to believe that family loyalty was the highest virtue. I thought about the woman I'd become in that exile, stronger and lonelier and more certain of who I was when everything else was stripped away. I looked at Marcus, this man who'd stood by me when it mattered, who'd risked his own career to support mine. Will you help me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. But Emma, if we're going down this road, you need to understand that it's not going to end with just Tyler getting better. If someone tried to hurt him to get to you, then they're going to try again when they realize we're asking questions. As we left the conference room and headed back towards Bay 3, I felt the familiar sensation of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 3 years ago, I'd walked into a sheriff's office with evidence that would destroy a man my family loved. Tonight, I was walking into something potentially more dangerous, armed with nothing but suspicion and the kind of stubborn determination that had already cost me everything once before. But as I pushed aside the curtain and saw Tyler's still form in that hospital bed, saw my mother's tear-strained face and my father's defeated posture, I knew that some things were worth losing everything for. Some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost, because the alternative was living with the knowledge that you could have saved someone and chose not to try. The war for Tyler's life was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't going to let family loyalty or small-town politics or the fear of losing what I little had stop me from doing what needed to be done. Part 2. The disrupting event. The toxicology results came back at 6:47 a.m., and they changed everything. Marcus found me in the hospital cafeteria, where I'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for 2 hours while watching the sunrise over
through windows that needed cleaning. He slid into the booth across from me, his face grim with the kind of expression that doctors wore when they had to deliver news that would shatter someone's world. "You were right," he said, quietly, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Tyler's blood work shows traces of succinylcholine." I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Succinylcholine was a paralytic agent used in surgery, a drug that would cause temporary muscle paralysis without leaving obvious traces in a standard toxicology screen. In the wrong hands, it could be used to incapacitate someone, make them helpless while maintaining consciousness. The implications hit me like a physical blow. "That's not possible," I whispered, even though I knew Marcus wouldn't have brought me false information. "Succinylcholine metabolizes quickly. It should be undetectable after a few hours." "Not if someone knew exactly how to preserve it for testing," Marcus replied. "Someone would have had to specifically look for it within a very narrow time window. The fact that it's still showing up in his system means whoever administered it either gave him a massive dose or," he paused, running his hand through his hair, "or they gave it to him multiple times." The cafeteria around us buzzed with the quiet morning activity of a hospital coming to life. Nurses grabbed quick breakfasts between shifts, residents stumbled through with coffee that would fuel 12-hour days, visitors clutched visitor badges and tried to navigate unfamiliar hallways. Normal people dealing with normal crises, while I sat across from Marcus, trying to process the fact that someone had deliberately paralyzed my brother before putting him behind the wheel of a car. "This wasn't an accident," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Someone drugged Tyler, probably when he was leaving the library. They made sure he couldn't control the car, then arranged for him to have a head-on collision with the drunk driver who conveniently walked away unharmed." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Emma, if that's true, then we're looking at attempted murder. And if someone was willing to go this far to hurt Tyler to get to you, then they're not going to stop just because he survived." I thought about Tyler at 19, sweet and trusting, and completely unprepared for the kind of evil that could masquerade as small-town justice. He'd been 8 when our parents had disowned me, old enough to understand that his big sister had done something that made Mom and Dad angry, but too young to grasp the complexity of choosing between family loyalty and moral responsibility. For 3 years, he'd been caught between loving me and respecting our parents' decision to cut me out of their lives. "I need to see the accident report," I said, my mind already moving to the next steps. I need to know exactly what happened on Route 9, who the other driver was, and why the police didn't think it was suspicious that a 19-year-old honors student suddenly lost control of a car he'd been driving safely for 3 years. The police report was filed by Deputy Tom Harrison, Marcus said, consulting the notes he'd scribbled on a napkin. But Emma, you should know that Harrison is Commissioner Garrett's nephew, and Garrett was one of Franklin Morrison's golf partners. The web of connections was becoming clearer, and it made my skin crawl. In a town like Millbrook, where everyone was related to everyone else either by blood or business, corruption could spread like a virus through family trees and social networks. Franklin Morrison hadn't just been my father's best friend. He'd been part of a whole ecosystem of men who'd grown up together, married each other's sisters, hired each other's sons, and protected each other's secrets. I want to talk to the other driver, the one who walked away unharmed. Marcus flipped through his notes again. According to the report, his name is Jake Brennan, 26 years old, previous DUI arrests in 2019 and 2021. He was allegedly driving home from Murphy's Bar when he crossed the center line and hit Tyler head-on. Allegedly? Well, here's the interesting part. Brennan's blood alcohol level was exactly 0.08%, not 0.09, not 0.12, but exactly at the legal limit. And he was released on his own recognizance 6 hours after the accident. I stared at Marcus, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in my mind. Someone paid him. Someone set this whole thing up to look like a drunk driving accident, but they were careful to make sure Brennan didn't actually face serious consequences. The succinylcholine in Tyler's system was supposed to be undetectable by the time anyone thought to look for it. But why Tyler? Marcus asked. If someone wanted to hurt you, why not come after you directly? The answer hit me like a punch to the gut, so obvious and cruel that I wondered how I'd missed it. Because coming after me directly wouldn't hurt me enough. I've already lost everything I thought I cared about. My career, my family, my place in this community. But Tyler, I had to stop and swallow hard before I could continue. He's the only person in my family who never stopped loving me. Even when my parents made him choose sides, he found ways to stay in touch. Birthday cards, text messages, emails that he'd delete after sending so our parents wouldn't know. He'd call me every few months just to check in. He'd tell me about school, about girls he was dating, about how much he missed having his big sister around. And I'd tell him about my life in the city, about the consulting work I was doing, about how I was building something new even though I missed home every single day. The weight of it all settled over me like a heavy blanket. Someone had figured out that Tyler was my weakness, the one person whose safety could bring me back to Millbrook despite everything I'd lost here. They'd used my love for him as a weapon, turning my brother into collateral damage in a war I thought was over 3 years ago. They made one mistake, though, I said, straightening up and pulling my hand away from Marcus's. They assumed that hurting Tyler would break me, make me give up and disappear permanently. They don't understand that hurting him just made me dangerous. Part 3. The Blocked Path. By 8 o'clock that morning, I'd learned exactly how deep the corruption ran in Millbrook County, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Every official channel I tried to access was blocked. Every authority figure I attempted to contact was either unavailable or actively hostile. It was like trying to navigate a maze where every path led back to the same dead end. My first call was to Detective Amy Foster, the one person in the police department who had supported my decision to report Franklin Morrison 3 years ago. Amy had been a rookie then, fresh out of the academy and still naive enough to believe that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. When I'd brought her evidence of Franklin's prescription scheme, she'd helped me document everything properly and had pushed for a thorough investigation, even when her superiors tried to bury it. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. You've reached Detective Foster. I'm currently unavailable, but if this is an emergency, please contact the main department line or call 911. I tried the main department line next, identifying myself to the dispatcher and asking to speak with Detective Foster about new evidence related to the Tyler Mitchell accident case. I'm sorry, ma'am, the dispatcher said, her voice carrying the kind of professional politeness that masked complete indifference.
Detective Foster is on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. I can transfer you to Detective Phillips if you'd like to discuss the Mitchell case. Detective Phillips? I knew that name, knew it belonged to a man who'd been Franklin Morrison's patient for 15 years, and who'd been one of the loudest voices calling for my prosecution when I'd exposed the prescription scheme. Phillips had been convinced that I'd fabricated evidence against Franklin, and he'd made his feelings known to anyone who would listen. "No, thank you," I told the dispatcher. "I'll call back later." But I knew I wouldn't. Amy Foster on administrative leave meant that someone had removed the one ally I might have had in the police department. It meant that whoever was orchestrating this had been planning for months, systematically eliminating anyone who might be willing to help me or ask inconvenient questions about Tyler's accident. My next call was to the district attorney's office, where I asked to speak with someone about potential criminal charges related to the Mitchell case. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached Assistant District Attorney Karen Wells, a woman whose voice sounded tired before 9 in the morning. "Miss Walsh," she said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "I understand you're concerned about your brother's accident, but I've reviewed the police report and the medical examiner's preliminary findings. This appears to be a straightforward case of drunk driving resulting in serious injury. We'll be pursuing appropriate charges against Mr. Brennan, of course." "What about the toxicology results showing succinylcholine in my brother's blood?" I asked. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Wells finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "I'm not aware of any such toxicology results, Miss Walsh. The hospital's standard testing didn't reveal any unusual substances." "Because succinylcholine isn't included in standard testing. It requires specific screening that has to be requested separately." "Miss Walsh, I understand you're upset about your brother's condition, but I need to caution you against making unfounded accusations. The medical professionals at Millbrook General are highly qualified, and they've assured us that Mr. Mitchell received appropriate care and testing." Another dead end. Wells either didn't know about the toxicology results Marcus had run, or she was actively ignoring them. Either way, it was clear that pursuing this through official channels would be like trying to swim upstream in a river that was designed to carry me away from the truth. I decided to try a different approach. Jennifer Kane, the neurosurgeon that Marcus had mentioned, was mysteriously unavailable to consult on Tyler's case, had a private practice in addition to her hospital work. I called her office directly, hoping to reach her before the hospital administration could interfere. "Dr. Kane's office, this is Michelle speaking." "Hi, Michelle. This is Emma Walsh. I'm calling about my brother Tyler Mitchell, who was injured in a car accident yesterday. I understand Dr. Kane was unavailable to consult on his case, and I wanted to schedule a private consultation to discuss his treatment options." Another pause, another shuffle of papers. "I'm sorry, Miss Walsh, but Dr. Kane is not available for private consultations at this time. She's taken a temporary leave of absence to deal with a family emergency." "When did this family emergency begin?" I asked. "Yesterday afternoon," Michelle replied, and I could hear the confusion in her voice. "It was very sudden. Dr. Kane called around 3 o'clock to say she had to leave town immediately and wouldn't be available for patient consultations for at least a week. Tyler's accident had happened around midnight. Dr. Kane had taken her sudden leave of absence 15 hours later, right around the time that someone would have realized Tyler might need specialized neurosurgical care." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I thanked Michelle and hung up, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and fear. Someone was systematically removing every person who might be able to help Tyler or investigate his case properly. Detective Foster on administrative leave, Dr. Kane suddenly out of town, the district attorney's office refusing to acknowledge evidence that didn't fit their preferred narrative. But it was worse than that. Someone wasn't just blocking my access to help, they were actively managing the information flow around Tyler's case. The police report that painted his accident as a simple drunk driving incident, the hospital administration's insistence that aggressive treatment would be futile, the convenient absence of every medical professional who might question the official story. This was a cover-up, but it was also something more sinister. It was a demonstration of power, a message sent not just to me but to anyone else in Millbrook who might be thinking about challenging the established order. "Look what happens when you cross us," the message said. "Look how thoroughly we can destroy not just you, but everyone you love." I thought about Franklin Morrison, sitting in his house on Elm Street, probably reading the morning paper and drinking coffee and feeling satisfied that justice had finally been served. Not legal justice, but the kind of small-town justice that said some people were too important to face consequences for their actions, and some people were too dangerous to be allowed to live peacefully among decent folks. The irony was that I'd never intended to stay in exile permanently. Over the past 3 years, I'd built a successful consulting practice in Philadelphia, helping hospitals and medical practices implement better safety protocols and compliance systems. I'd made peace with my decision to leave Millbrook, had even started to think that maybe the distance had been good for everyone involved.
Planning to eventually reach out to my parents to see if enough time had passed for us to rebuild some kind of relationship. But someone couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. Someone needed to make sure I understood that I would never be welcome in Millbrook again, that any attempt to come home would result in consequences too terrible to risk. They'd turned Tyler into their weapon, and in doing so, they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives, because they'd reminded me why I'd chosen truth over comfort 3 years ago. They'd shown me that the corruption I'd exposed was still alive and thriving, still hurting innocent people, still protecting the wrong people from facing the consequences of their actions. And they'd given me a reason to fight that was stronger than anything I'd felt when it was just my own reputation and career on the line. Tyler was lying in that hospital bed because someone wanted to send me a message. Now I had a message to send back. And it was going to be delivered through every official channel, every media outlet, and every legal avenue I could access. The difference was that my message was going to be backed up by evidence, documentation, and the kind of righteous anger that could move mountains when it was properly focused. They'd made this personal when they'd hurt Tyler. Now, they were going to learn exactly what happened when someone with nothing left to lose decided to take the gloves off. Part 4. The Insider Guide. I was sitting in my rental car outside Millbrook General, trying to figure out my next move, when someone tapped on my passenger window. I looked up to see a woman in navy blue scrubs, maybe 35 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd been working double shifts. She gestured for me to roll down the window. "You're Emma Walsh?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Do I know you?" "I'm Lisa Brooks. I'm a nurse in the ICU, and I need to talk to you about your brother, but not here. Meet me at the Riverside Diner on Route 9 in 20 minutes. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going." She walked away before I could ask any questions, leaving me staring after her and wondering if this was another trap or the break I'd been hoping for. In a town where everyone was seeming to work against me, the appearance of a potential ally felt too good to be true. But Tyler was running out of time, and I was running out of options. The Riverside Diner was a relic from the 1950s, all chrome and red vinyl and black and white checkered floors. It sat on a lonely stretch of Route 9, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and pie, and where locals went when they wanted to have conversations that wouldn't be overheard by the wrong people. I'd eaten there countless times as a teenager, back when sneaking out to meet friends felt like the biggest rebellion imaginable. Lisa Brooks was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a sweater, but she still looked like someone who was constantly braced for the next emergency. I slid into the booth across from her, noting that she'd positioned herself where she could see anyone coming before they could see her. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. "Though I have to ask, why all the secrecy?" Lisa glanced around the diner, which was nearly empty except for a tired-looking waitress and a man in a trucking company uniform hunched over a plate of eggs at the counter. "Because 3 nurses have been suspended or transferred in the last 18 months for asking questions about patient care that made the administration uncomfortable. Because the hospital's new ownership has made it very clear that employee loyalty is more important than patient advocacy. And because your brother isn't the first person to end up in our ICU with injuries that don't match the official story."
She reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, setting it on the table between us. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. I've been documenting irregularities in patient care for the past year, building a file that I plan to turn over to the state medical board when I had enough evidence to make a compelling case. Your brother's situation has convinced me that I can't wait any longer. The waitress approached our table, and Lisa quickly slipped the recorder back into her purse. We ordered coffee and waited until the waitress was out of earshot before continuing our conversation. "Tell me about Tyler," I said. Lisa pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos that made my blood run cold. They were pictures of Tyler's medical chart, taken covertly from angles that wouldn't reveal the photographer's identity. But what they revealed about Tyler's treatment was damning enough to destroy careers and possibly land people in prison. "Your brother was brought in at 1:23 a.m., Lisa said, her voice low and urgent. The initial assessment noted that his pupils were dilated and non-reactive, consistent with neurological trauma. But look at this entry, made at 2:45 a.m. She pointed to a line in the chart that had been crossed out and initialed. The attending physician noted that Tyler's muscle tone was inconsistent with unconsciousness from head trauma. He was too relaxed, too flaccid. That's a classic sign of paralytic agent poisoning. But someone made him change his assessment? Dr. Hayes came down personally at 3:15 a.m. She spoke privately with the attending physician for about 10 minutes, and when they were done, he'd amended his notes to remove any reference to unusual muscle tone. The original assessment was struck from the record. I stared at the photos, my hands clenched into fists under the table. Dr. Hayes was here at 3:15 in the morning? That's not normal for a hospital administrator. No, it's not. Hospital administrators don't usually show up in the middle of the night unless someone very important calls them personally. And here's the thing, Emma. Dr. Hayes got that call before Tyler's accident was even reported to the hospital. She was already here when the ambulance arrived. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Victoria Hayes hadn't responded to an emergency. She was prepared for it. Someone called her in advance, told her to be at the hospital to manage Tyler's case personally. She was positioned to control the narrative from the moment Tyler arrived. "There's more," Lisa continued, swiping to another photo. "The blood work that was ordered for Tyler was unusual. Instead of the standard trauma panel, someone specifically requested tests that would mask the presence of paralytic agents. And the neurological assessments were delayed for 6 hours, long enough for any succinylcholine in his system to metabolize naturally. But Dr. Bennett ran an independent talk screen that showed
Succinylcholine. Lisa nodded grimly. I know. I'm the one who drew the blood for him, and I'm the one who made sure it was processed through a lab that isn't connected to Moberg General. Dr. Bennett was taking a huge risk by ordering that test, because if the administration finds out, they'll fire him and make sure he never works in this county again. I thought about Marcus, risking his career to help me find the truth about Tyler's condition. It reminded me of the choice I'd faced 3 years ago, when I discovered Franklin Morrison's prescription scheme. The safe thing would have been to keep quiet, to mind my own business, to let someone else deal with the consequences. But Marcus had chosen to help me anyway, just like Lisa was choosing to speak up now despite the personal cost. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "You don't know me, and you're risking your job by talking to me." Lisa was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee cup as if she could find answers in the dark liquid. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because 6 months ago, a 17-year-old girl named Amanda Parker was brought into our ER after what was reported as a suicide attempt. Overdose of prescription painkillers. Found unconscious in her bedroom by her parents. But the injection site on her arm was all wrong for self-administration, and she had defensive wounds on her hands that suggested she'd fought with someone. What happened to her? Dr. Hayes personally managed her case. The police report was filed by Deputy Harrison, the same one who filed your brother's accident report.
Amanda's parents were told that she'd been struggling with depression and drug addiction, and that the hospital recommended long-term psychiatric treatment. She was transferred to a facility in Pittsburgh, and as far as I know, she's still there. I felt sick. And you think someone deliberately overdosed her? I think Amanda Parker found out something she wasn't supposed to know, and someone decided she needed to be silenced permanently. The psychiatric facility she was sent to specializes in treating patients with severe mental illness and substance abuse problems, patients who are too unstable to be reliable witnesses if they ever tried to testify about what happened to them. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more sinister than I had imagined. Someone wasn't just covering up individual crimes, they were systematically silencing anyone who posed a threat to their operations. Amanda Parker, Tyler, even Detective Foster's sudden administrative leave, all part of a coordinated effort to maintain control over Millbrook County's official narrative. Lisa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Do you think Tyler is going to recover? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with professional knowledge that she wished she didn't possess. Your brother's brain injury is serious, but it's not necessarily fatal. The problem is that he's not receiving the aggressive treatment he needs because Dr. Hayes has determined that it's not worth the risk to the hospital. She's more concerned about liability than about saving his life. What kind of treatment does he need? Surgical intervention to relieve the intracranial pressure, aggressive medication to reduce brain swelling, and consultation with a neurosurgeon who specializes in trauma cases, all of which Dr. Hayes has refused to authorize because she claims the risks are too high. I leaned back in the booth, my mind racing through possibilities. What if Tyler could be transferred to another hospital, somewhere outside of Millbrook County, where Dr. Hayes couldn't control his treatment? Lisa shook her head. Medical transfers require approval from the attending physician and the hospital administration. And they require a receiving hospital that's willing to accept the patient. Dr. Hayes has already contacted every major hospital within 100 miles, informing that Tyler Mitchell's case is being managed appropriately and that transfer requests should be denied. Another dead end, another example of how thoroughly someone had planned this operation. They'd blocked every official channel, removed every potential ally, and positioned themselves to control every aspect of Tyler's care. It was like being trapped in a maze where all the walls were invisible but absolutely solid. But there was something in Lisa's expression that suggested she had more to tell me, something she was holding back until she was sure she could trust me completely. "There's one more thing," she said, glancing around the diner again to make sure we weren't being overheard. Dr. Kane, the neurosurgeon who was supposedly unavailable to consult on Tyler's case, she didn't leave town because of a family emergency. What do you mean? I mean, she was forced out. Dr. Hayes and Commissioner Garrett met with her yesterday afternoon, about an hour after Tyler was brought in. I don't know exactly what they said to her, but whatever it was, it convinced her to pack up and leave town immediately. Dr. Kane has been fighting the hospital administration for months over patient care issues, and I think they used Tyler's case as leverage to get rid of her permanently. I felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. They threatened her? More than that, they have something on her, something they've been holding over her head for months. I don't know what it is, but it's serious enough that she was willing to abandon her patients and her practice rather than risk having it exposed. The scope of the conspiracy was beginning to overwhelm me. It wasn't just about Tyler, wasn't just about getting revenge on me for exposing Franklin Morrison. Someone had been planning this for months, systematically compromising or removing anyone who posed a threat to their operations. They'd turned the hospital, the police department, and the court system into tools for maintaining their power and silencing their enemies. Lisa, I need your help. I need someone inside the hospital who can monitor Tyler's condition and make sure he gets the care he needs, even if it has to be done unofficially. She nodded without hesitation. I'm already doing that. I've been checking on him every hour, documenting his vital signs and neurological responses. If his condition deteriorates, I'll contact Dr. Bennett immediately, regardless of what Dr. Hayes has ordered. And I need documentation of everything we've discussed. The photos, the medical records, the timeline of events. Everything that proves Tyler's case was mishandled from the beginning. Lisa reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table. It's all there. Medical records, photographs, even audio recordings of conversations between Dr. Hayes and hospital staff about how to handle Tyler's case. I've been building this file for months, waiting for the right moment.
Expose what's been happening at Millbrook General. I palmed the USB drive, feeling the weight of evidence that could bring down the entire corrupt network. But I also felt the weight of responsibility for Lisa's safety, for Tyler's life, for all the other victims who'd been silenced or discredited or disappeared when they'd posed a threat to the wrong people. They're going to come after you when they realize you've been documenting their activities, I warned her. Lisa smiled grimly. Let them try. I've got copies of everything stored in multiple locations, and I've already sent packages to journalists and medical board investigators with instructions to open them if anything happens to me. Besides, someone needs to be the voice for patients who can't speak for themselves. Someone needs to stand up to bullies who think they can destroy people's lives without facing consequences. I looked at this woman who was risking everything to help my brother and to expose a system of corruption that extended far beyond just one family's tragedy. She reminded me of the person I'd been 3 years ago, before I'd learned how much it could cost to choose truth over loyalty. But she also reminded me of the person I could be again if I was willing to fight for something bigger than just my own family's pain. Thank you, I said, for Tyler, for Amanda Parker, for everyone else who's been hurt by these people. Thank you for not looking the away. Lisa finished her coffee and stood to leave. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Tyler wakes up and tells us exactly what happened to him on Route 9, because that's when we're really going to shake things up in this town. As I watched her walk out of the diner and disappear into the parking lot, I realized that I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally inside the hospital, evidence that could expose the conspiracy, and most importantly, I had a clear understanding of what I was up against. The war for Tyler's life had become something much bigger, and I was ready to fight it with everything I had. Part 5. The point of commitment. I sat in that diner booth for another 20 minutes after Lisa left, staring at the USB drive in my palm and thinking about choices. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take Tyler's medical records to the FBI field office in Pittsburgh and let federal investigators handle the corruption in Millbrook County. I could document everything, file official reports, and wait for justice to work its way through proper channels while staying safely out of the line of fire. But Tyler didn't have time for proper channels. Every hour that passed without aggressive treatment was another hour of potential permanent brain damage. Every day that Dr. Hayes controlled his care was another day closer to the kind of neurological complications that could leave him in a vegetative state or worse. The federal investigation could take months or years to produce results, and Tyler would be dead or disabled long before anyone was held accountable for what had been done to him. I thought about Amanda Parker, drugged and committed to a psychiatric facility where her testimony about what had really happened to her would be dismissed as the delusions of a mentally ill addict. I thought about Detective Foster, suddenly placed on administrative leave when she might have been willing to investigate Tyler's case honestly. I thought about Dr. Kane, forced to abandon her patients and her practice rather than risk whatever leverage Commissioner Garrett and Dr. Hayes had been holding over her. These people had been destroying lives for years, using their positions of authority to protect each other and silence anyone who threatened their operations. They'd turned institutions that were supposed to serve justice and protect the vulnerable into weapons for maintaining their own power. And they'd gotten away with it because good people had been too afraid or too isolated to fight back effectively. But I wasn't isolated anymore. I had Lisa Brooks inside the hospital, documenting everything and ready to risk her career to save Tyler's life. I had Marcus Bennett willing to break hospital protocols to run unauthorized medical tests. I had evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy if I was smart enough and brave enough to use it properly. More importantly, I had something that my enemies didn't expect: nothing left to lose. They'd already destroyed my career in Millbrook County, driven me away from my family, and turned my hometown into a place where I was unwelcome. The worst thing they could do to me had already been done 3 years ago, which meant I was free to fight them without worrying about the personal cost. I pulled out my phone and made the first call, to a number I'd memorized but never thought I'd have to use. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Pittsburgh Field Office. This is Agent Martinez.
Agent Martinez, my name's Emma Walsh. I have evidence of a conspiracy involving police corruption, medical malpractice, and possibly attempted murder in Millbrook County, Pennsylvania. I need to speak with someone immediately about opening a federal investigation. There was a pause, the sound of computer keys clicking, and then Agent Martinez's voice came back more alert and focused. Ms. Walsh, can you give me a brief overview of the nature of this conspiracy? I took a deep breath and began explaining about Tyler's accident, the toxicology results, the pattern of officials being removed or compromised, and the evidence Lisa had gathered about other suspicious cases. Agent Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. Ms. Walsh, this is definitely something we need to investigate. However, I need to be honest with you about our timeline. Opening a federal investigation requires authorization from multiple levels, and gathering evidence that will hold up in court takes time. We're talking about months before we can move forward with arrests or prosecutions. My brother doesn't have months, I said. He needs medical treatment now, and the people responsible for his condition are controlling his care to make sure he doesn't recover enough to testify about what happened to him. I understand your urgency and will expedite this investigation as much as possible, but in the meantime, you need to be careful. If you're right about this conspiracy, then the people involved will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. That includes eliminating anyone who poses a threat to their operations. I thanked Agent Martinez and hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved that federal investigators would eventually bring justice and frustrated that Tyler couldn't wait for eventually. I needed a way to force the conspirators into the open, now, to create enough pressure that they'd make mistakes and expose themselves. My second call was to Jake Morgan, the investigative journalist whose number Lisa had given me along with the USB drive. Jake had built a reputation for exposing corruption in small-town Pennsylvania,
And according to Lisa, he'd been investigating irregularities at Millbrook General for months. "Emma Walsh," he said when I identified myself. "I was wondering when you'd surface. I've been following your brother's case since yesterday morning." "You have?" "Emma, Tyler Mitchell's accident made the police blotter, but it also triggered some automated alerts I'd set up for certain types of incidents in Millbrook County. When a young man with no history of reckless driving suddenly loses control of his car and has a head-on collision with a repeat DUI offender, it raises red flags for someone who's been tracking patterns of suspicious accidents." I felt a surge of hope. "What kind of patterns?" "Over the past 18 months, there have been 7 incidents in Millbrook County where young people were seriously injured or killed in accidents that were officially attributed to driver error, substance abuse, or mental health crises. But when you look at the details, all 7 cases involve victims who had some connection to people who'd been causing problems for the local power structure." "What kind of connections?" "Amanda Parker was dating a young man whose father had been asking questions about irregularities in county construction contracts. Michael Torres was a college student who'd been researching a paper about prescription drug abuse in rural communities. Sarah Williams was a high school senior who'd been planning to testify in a lawsuit against the school district. All of them ended up in situations that eliminated their ability to cause trouble for the people they'd been investigating or opposing. The scope of it was staggering. They've been systematically targeting anyone who posed a threat to their operations. And they've been very good at making it look like accidents, mental health crises, or personal failures. Until you have all the cases laid out together, it's easy to dismiss each one as an isolated tragedy. But when you see the pattern, it becomes clear that someone has been cleaning house very methodically." I thought about Tyler, sweet and trusting and completely unaware that staying in touch with his exiled sister had painted a target on his back. He'd never posed any direct threat to anyone. His only crime had been loving me, despite our parents' disapproval. Part 6. The transition phase. The drive back to Millbrook General felt different this time, charged with purpose instead of desperate uncertainty. I had allies now, evidence, and most importantly, a plan that went beyond just trying to save Tyler's life. We were going to dismantle the entire corrupt network that had been terrorizing this county for years, and we were going to do it in a way that left no room for cover-ups or convenient disappearances. Jake Morgan had agreed to meet me at the hospital in 2 hours with a camera crew from Channel 7 News in Pittsburgh. He'd been investigating corruption in Millbrook County for 8 months, building a story that was missing just one crucial element: a victim's family member willing to go on camera and demand answers.
I was going to be that family member, and Tyler's case was going to be the spark that ignited a media firestorm. But first, I needed to make sure Tyler was stable enough to survive what was coming. Once we went public with accusations of attempted murder and conspiracy, the people responsible would either panic and make mistakes, or they'd double down and try to eliminate any remaining evidence. That evidence included Tyler himself, and I couldn't protect him if I didn't know exactly what his medical situation was. I parked in the hospital visitor lot and sat for a moment watching people come and go through the main entrance. Families carrying flowers and balloons, medical professionals hurrying between shifts, delivery drivers wheeling supplies through automatic doors that opened and closed with mechanical precision. Normal life continuing around the edges of a conspiracy that most people couldn't see. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. Tyler's condition stable but not improving. Dr. Hayes scheduled family meeting at 2 p.m. to discuss end-of-life options. You need to be there. End-of-life options. 24 hours after Tyler's accident, Dr. Hayes was already pushing my parents toward giving up on him. It was exactly what Lisa had predicted, the systematic management of Tyler's case to ensure that he never recovered enough to testify about what had really happened on Route 9. I texted back, "I'll be there, and I'm bringing backup." The main entrance of Millbrook General led through a marble-floored lobby that was supposed to project stability and competence. Inspirational quotes about healing and hope were mounted on the walls in elegant frames, and the reception desk was staffed by volunteers who smiled professionally at everyone who passed. It was all carefully designed to make visitors feel confident about the care their loved ones would receive. But I could see through the facade now. Could recognize it as window dressing meant to disguise an institution that prioritized profit and political connections over patient welfare. The marble floors and inspirational quotes couldn't hide the fact that decisions about Tyler's care were being made based on what was convenient for Dr. Hayes and her allies, not what was best for his recovery. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor where the ICU was located and found Lisa Brooks updating charts at the nurses' station. She looked up when I approached, and I could see the controlled urgency in her expression that meant something important had happened. "We need to talk," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other staff members were within earshot. "Tyler's condition changed about an hour ago." My heart jumped into my throat. Changed how? Better or worse? Better. His intracranial pressure dropped significantly, and he started showing more responsive reflexes. Dr. Bennett thinks the swelling in his brain is finally beginning to reduce naturally. I felt a surge of hope so powerful it made my knees weak. That's good news, right? That means he might wake up soon. Lisa nodded, but her expression remained troubled. It is good news medically, but Emma, Dr. Hayes was not happy when she saw Tyler's improved readings. She immediately ordered increased sedation to keep him unconscious, claiming that brain injury patients recover better when they're kept in medically induced comas. Is that true? Sometimes yes, but not in Tyler's case. His brain injury was never severe enough to require prolonged sedation, and keeping him unconscious now that the swelling is reducing could actually slow his recovery. Dr. Hayes isn't trying to help Tyler heal. She's trying to make sure he stays unconscious until... She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Until the family meeting where Dr. Hayes would convince my parents to authorize withdrawal of life support. Until Tyler could be quietly allowed to die without ever waking up to tell anyone what had really happened.
Had really happened to him. How long does Tyler have before the sedation causes permanent damage? It's hard to say, but prolonged sedation can cause muscle atrophy, pneumonia, blood clots, and other complications that become life-threatening over time. Dr. Hayes is essentially creating a medical emergency that will justify the decision to let Tyler die. I thought about my parents, sitting beside Tyler's bed for 24 hours, watching machines breathe for him, and trusting that the medical professionals knew what was best. They had no way of knowing that Tyler's treatment was being deliberately mismanaged, no reason to question the authority of doctors and administrators who projected confidence and expertise. "I need to see him before the family meeting," I said. Lisa glanced at her watch. "Dr. Hayes is in surgery until 1:30, so the coast is clear for now. But Emma, you should know that security has been instructed to call Dr. Hayes immediately if you're seen anywhere near Tyler's room without family escort." "Then I guess I need a family escort." I found my parents in the family waiting area, a depressing room with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines where families were supposed to maintain hope while their loved ones fought for their lives. My mother was dozing fitfully in the chair by the window, exhaustion finally overcoming her determination to maintain a constant vigil. My father sat beside her, staring at his hands and looking older than his 63 years. They both looked up when I entered, and I saw a complex mixture of emotions cross their faces. Relief that I was there, guilt about needing me after 3 years of silence, and uncertainty about how to navigate a relationship that had been shattered by choices none of us could take back. "How is he?" I asked, settling into a chair across from them. "The same," my father said. "The doctors say he's stable, but..." He gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the helplessness of watching your child hover between life and death. "Dr. Hayes wants to meet with us at 2 o'clock, my mother added. "She said there are decisions we need to make about Tyler's care." I looked at these two people who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework and cheered at my high school graduation. 3 years ago, they had chosen to believe that I was capable of fabricating evidence against an innocent man, rather than accepting that someone they trusted had been betraying that trust. But seeing them now, exhausted and terrified and clinging to hope that their son would recover, I realized that their choice had been as much about fear as it had been about loyalty. They were afraid of a world where respected community leaders could be corrupt, where authority figures couldn't be trusted, where doing the right thing didn't guarantee protection from consequences. It was easier to believe that I had been wrong than to accept that the system they'd trusted to protect their family was actually capable of destroying it. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something about Tyler's accident. Something the doctors and the police haven't told you." My father's expression hardened. "Emma, please, not now. We can't handle any more crisis right now." "This isn't about creating a crisis. This is about understanding that Tyler's life is in danger from the very people who are supposed to be helping him recover." I pulled out my phone and showed them the toxicology results that Marcus had run, explaining what succinylcholine was and what its presence in Tyler's blood meant. I told them about the pattern of suspicious accidents that Jake Morgan had identified, about Amanda Parker and the other young people who had been silenced when they posed threats to powerful people. My mother listened with growing horror, her hand pressed to her mouth as the implications became clear. My father's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of resigned devastation, as he realized that the world he'd trusted to protect his family had been turned against them. "You're telling us that someone deliberately hurt Tyler?" my mother whispered. "I'm telling you that someone drugged Tyler to incapacitate him, then arranged for him to have an accident that was supposed to kill him, and now they're controlling his medical care to make sure he doesn't recover enough to tell anyone what really happened." "But why?" my father asked. "Tyler never hurt anyone. He's just a kid." "Because Tyler's only crime was staying in touch with me after you disowned me, because someone wanted to send me a message that I would never be safe in Millbrook County, and they decided to use Tyler as their messenger." The weight of that realization settled over my parents like a blanket of guilt and horror. They were beginning to understand that their decision to exile me 3 years ago hadn't protected their family from the consequences of my choices. Instead, it had made Tyler vulnerable to people who saw him as leverage against me. "What do we do?" my mother asked. "We go to that family meeting at 2 o'clock, and we make sure Tyler gets the medical care he actually needs instead of the care that Dr. Hayes wants him to receive. And then we make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to him faces the consequences of their actions." My father looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was a child, a mixture of pride and fear and desperate hope. "You have a plan?" "I have allies, evidence, and a journalist who's been investigating corruption in this county for months. What I need from you is permission to fight for Tyler's life, even if it means exposing some uncomfortable truths about people you've trusted." There was a long silence as my parents processed what I was asking of them. 3 years ago, they had chosen loyalty to their community over support for their daughter. Now I was asking them to choose support for their son over loyalty to the system that had betrayed them. "What do we do?" my mother asked finally. "We go to that family meeting at 2 o'clock and we make sure Tyler gets the medical care he actually needs instead of the care that Dr. Hayes wants him to receive. And then we make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to him faces the consequences of their actions." My father looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was a child, a mixture of pride and fear and desperate hope. "You have a plan?" "I have allies, evidence, and a journalist who's been investigating corruption in this county for months. What I need from you is permission to fight for Tyler's life, even if it means exposing some uncomfortable truths about people you've trusted." There was a long silence as my parents processed what I was asking of them. 3 years ago, they had chosen loyalty to their community over support for their daughter. Now I was asking them to choose support for their son over loyalty to the system that had betrayed them. "What do we do?" my mother asked finally. "We go to that family meeting at 2 o'clock and we make sure Tyler gets the medical care he actually needs instead of the care that Dr. Hayes wants him to receive. And then we make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to him faces the consequences of their actions." My father looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was a child, a mixture of pride and fear and desperate hope. "You have a plan?" "I have allies, evidence, and a journalist who's been investigating corruption in this county for months. What I need from you is permission to fight for Tyler's life, even if it means exposing some uncomfortable truths about people you've trusted." There was a long silence as my parents processed what I was asking of them. 3 years ago, they had chosen loyalty to their community over support for their daughter. Now I was asking them to choose support for their son over loyalty to the system that had betrayed them. "What do we do?" my mother asked finally. "We go to that family meeting at 2 o'clock and we make sure Tyler gets the medical care he actually needs instead of the care that Dr. Hayes wants him to receive. And then we make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to him faces the consequences of their actions." My father looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since I was a child, a mixture of pride and fear and desperate hope. "You have a plan?" "I have allies, evidence, and a journalist who's been investigating corruption in this county for months. What I need from you is permission to fight for Tyler's life, even if it means exposing some uncomfortable truths about people you've trusted." "What do we do?" my mother asked finally. "We go to that family meeting at 2 o'clock and we make sure Tyler gets the medical care he actually needs instead of the care that Dr. Hayes wants him to receive. And then we make sure that everyone responsible for what happened to him faces the consequences of their actions." My father reached across the space between our chairs and took my hand. A gesture carried 3 years of misconnection and regret. "Emma, I'm sorry. We should have believed you about Franklin Morrison. We should have stood by you instead of choosing sides." I squeezed his hand, feeling tears that I'd been holding back for years finally threatening to spill over. "We can talk about forgiveness later, Dad. Right now, we need to focus on making sure Tyler survives this." Part 7. The Strategic Declaration. The family meeting was scheduled in Dr. Hayes' office, a tiny room that was full of big, comfortable chairs.
Space designed to project authority and inspire confidence in medical decisions. The walls were lined with degrees and certifications. The desk was polished mahogany that reflected the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. And everything was arranged to reinforce the power dynamic between medical professionals and the families who depended on their expertise.
Dr. Victoria Hayes herself was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested both wealth and taste. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, the final authority on questions of life and death. When she spoke, people listened. When she made recommendations, families followed them without question. But I wasn't most families, and I had no intention of being impressed by her credentials or intimidated by her authority. My parents and I arrived at her office precisely at 2 o'clock, presenting a united front that I hoped would give Dr. Hayes pause about her planned manipulation of Tyler's care. My mother had changed into a navy blue dress that she usually reserved for church, and my father wore the suit he kept for funerals and court appearances. They looked like respectable people who deserved honest answers about their son's condition. Dr. Hayes greeted us with the kind of professional sympathy that doctors practice in front of mirrors, all concern and gravitas and carefully modulated warmth. She gestured for us to sit in chairs arranged in front of her desk, positioning herself as the authority figure who would guide us through difficult decisions. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, Emma, she began, consulting a file that I assumed contained Tyler's medical records. Thank you for coming. I know this is an incredibly difficult time for your family, and I want to make sure you have all the information you need to make informed decisions about Tyler's care. I noticed that she addressed my parents first and included me almost as an afterthought, a subtle way of establishing the hierarchy she expected for this conversation. She assumed that my parents would defer to medical authority and that I would defer to my parents' wishes. Dr. Hayes, I said before she could continue, before we discuss Tyler's care, I'd like to understand why he hasn't received consultation from a neurosurgeon given the nature of his injuries. Her expression didn't change, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested my question wasn't welcome. Dr. Kane was unfortunately unavailable due to a family emergency, and bringing in an outside consultant would delay treatment unnecessarily. I've consulted with colleagues in Pittsburgh, and we're confident that Tyler is receiving appropriate care. What colleagues in Pittsburgh? I'd like their names and the dates of these consultations. Now Dr. Hayes did look annoyed, though she tried to disguise it as concern for my emotional state. Emma, I understand that you're worried about Tyler, but questioning medical decisions isn't helpful right now. We need to focus on what's best for Tyler going forward. What's best for Tyler is aggressive treatment to reduce the brain swelling and give him the best possible chance of recovery. Instead, you've increased his sedation levels even though his intracranial pressure has improved significantly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dr. Hayes set down her file and looked at me with the kind of cold assessment that doctors usually reserved for difficult patients who refuse to follow medical advice. I'm not sure where you're getting your information, Emma, but Tyler's sedation levels are appropriate for his condition. Brain injury patients require careful management to prevent secondary complications, like regaining consciousness and being able to remember what happened to him. My mother drew in a sharp breath, and my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Hayes's mask of professional sympathy finally slipped, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. I think there may be some confusion about Tyler's prognosis, she said carefully. The reality is that his brain injury is quite severe, and the likelihood of meaningful recovery is limited. We need to discuss quality of life issues and consider what Tyler would want if he were able to express his wishes. Tyler is 19 years old, with no previous medical history and a brain injury that should respond well to appropriate treatment. The only reason his recovery is limited is because you're actively preventing it. Dr. Hayes stood up from behind her desk, using her height and position to assert dominance over the conversation. Emma, I understand that you have some medical training, but you're not Tyler's doctor. The decisions about his care need to be made by qualified professionals in consultation with his immediate family. His immediate family includes me. I'm his sister, and I have every right to question treatment decisions that don't make medical sense. Actually,
Dr. Hayes said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You don't. Tyler is over 18, which means his medical decisions need to be made by his legal next of kin. Since he's unmarried, that authority falls to his parents. And his parents have been properly informed about his condition and prognosis. She turned to address my mother and father directly, dismissing me as if I were a child having a tantrum. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, the difficult reality is that Tyler's brain injury has caused significant damage that is unlikely to heal. Keeping him on life support indefinitely won't change that fact, but it will prolong suffering for both Tyler and your family. My mother looked stricken, tears streaming down her face, as Dr. Hayes painted a picture of hopelessness designed to make withdrawal of life support seem like the merciful choice. My father reached for my mother's hand, his own face gray with the weight of an impossible decision. "What are you recommending?" my father asked quietly. "I'm recommending that we transition Tyler to comfort care. We would remove the ventilator and allow him to pass peacefully, without prolonging the inevitable. It's what most families choose in situations like this." I felt rage building in my chest like pressure in a boiler, but I forced myself to speak calmly and clearly. "Dr. Hayes, are you aware that Tyler's blood work shows traces of succinylcholine, a paralytic agent that wouldn't be present unless someone deliberately administered it to him?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hayes went completely still, her face carefully blank in the way that people practiced when they were trying to hide shock or guilt. My parents looked between us, sensing the shift in dynamics but not understanding what had just happened. "I'm not sure where you're getting your information, Emma, but Tyler's sedation levels are appropriate for his condition. Brain injury patients require careful management to prevent secondary complications. Like regaining consciousness and being able to remember what happened to him."
Interpreted by people without proper training. The toxicology results were interpreted by Dr. Marcus Bennett, who has the proper training and who specifically tested for substances that wouldn't show up in standard screening. Would you like to explain why someone would want to paralyze Tyler before his accident? Dr. Hayes sat back down, and I could see her mentally recalibrating her approach. She'd expected a grief-stricken family who would accept her recommendations without question. Instead, she was facing someone who had evidence of criminal activity and wasn't afraid to use it. "Emma, I think you're overwrought and looking for someone to blame for Tyler's accident. It's natural to want answers when something terrible happens, but conspiracy theories aren't going to help Tyler recover." Then let's test the conspiracy theory. Let's bring in an independent neurosurgeon for a second opinion on Tyler's condition. Let's run additional toxicology tests to confirm the presence of succinylcholine. Let's examine the accident scene and interview witnesses who might have seen something suspicious. Or, Dr. Hayes said, her voice taking on a harder edge, we could focus on providing Tyler with appropriate end-of-life care instead of pursuing fantasies that will only cause more pain for everyone involved. I stood up, matching her attempt to use physical positioning for psychological advantage. "Dr. Hayes, let me be very clear about something. Tyler is not going to die on your watch, and he's not going to be transferred to a long-term care facility where he can be quietly neglected until he develops complications that finish what his attackers started." "Emma," my father said softly, "maybe we should—" "No, Dad. Maybe we should stop letting people convince us that accepting injustice is the same thing as being reasonable. Maybe we should stop trusting people who smile while they're lying to our faces." I turned back to Dr. Hayes, who was watching me with the kind of cold calculation that reminded me why I'd never liked her during my years as a paramedic. "You're going to authorize aggressive treatment for Tyler's brain injury. You're going to bring in a qualified neurosurgeon for consultation, and you're going to document every aspect of his care so that when he recovers, there's a clear record of how his life was saved despite your best efforts to let him die." Dr. Hayes' professional mask finally cracked completely, revealing the anger and frustration underneath. "And if I refuse? Then at 3 o'clock this afternoon, Channel 7 News is going to run a story about systematic medical malpractice at Millbrook General Hospital, featuring interviews with families whose loved ones receive substandard care under your administration.
Tyler's ace will be the centerpiece of that story, along with documentation of how you've been manipulating medical decisions for political reasons. The threat hung in the air between us, like smoke from a gun barrel. Dr. Hayes stared at me, probably calculating whether I was bluffing and what the consequences would be if I wasn't. Around us, the office that had been designed to project authority and control suddenly felt smaller, less impressive, more like what it actually was. A room where one person made decisions about other people's lives based on criteria that had nothing to do with medical ethics. "You're making a serious mistake, Emma," Dr. Hayes said finally. "There are forces at work here that you don't understand and people who won't tolerate interference with their plans. Then those people are going to discover that I'm not the scared little girl who ran away from Millbrook County 3 years ago. I'm the woman who destroyed Franklin Morrison's operation, and I'm prepared to do the same thing to anyone else who thinks they can hurt my family without consequences." Dr. Hayes reached for her phone, and for a moment I thought she was going to call security to have us removed from her office. Instead, she dialed a number and waited for someone to answer. "It's Victoria," she said when the call connected. "We have a problem with the Mitchell situation. Emma Walsh is here, and she knows about the succinylcholine." I couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the line, but I could see Dr. Hayes' expression growing more tense as she listened to whatever instructions she was receiving. "I understand," she said finally. "I'll handle it." She hung up and looked at my parents, her professional mask sliding back into place like a costume. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I think it would be best if you took some time to consider your options. We can schedule another meeting tomorrow to discuss Tyler's care." "We don't need more time," my mother said, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. "We want Tyler to receive the best possible care, and we want an independent doctor to evaluate his condition. If Emma says the current treatment isn't appropriate, then we want it changed." My father nodded his agreement, and I felt a surge of gratitude for these people who had chosen to trust me despite 3 years of estrangement. "And we want to know who Emma has been talking to on that phone call, and what plans they're referring to that we supposedly don't understand." Dr. Hayes' composure was cracking again, revealing the pressure she was under from whoever had been giving her instructions. "I can't discuss internal hospital matters with people who aren't directly involved in Tyler's care." "Then maybe it's time for people who aren't directly involved in Tyler's care to stop making decisions about it. Tyler's medical treatment should be based on his condition and his needs, not on what's convenient for your bosses or what sends the right message to your enemies." I gathered my purse and stood to leave, my parents following my lead. "Dr. Hayes, you have until 5 o'clock to arrange for proper neurological consultation and to adjust Tyler's treatment plan to focus on recovery rather than management. If Tyler's care doesn't improve by then, tomorrow morning's news cycle is going to be very uncomfortable for everyone associated with this hospital." As we walked toward the door, Dr. Hayes called after us one more time. "Emma, you're playing a dangerous game with people who have more power than you realize. Think carefully about whether Tyler's life is worth the risk you're taking." I turned back to look at her. This woman who was supposed to be dedicated to healing and protecting the vulnerable, who had instead chosen to become a weapon in someone else's war against justice and accountability. "Dr. Hayes, Tyler's life is exactly what this is about. And if you think I'm going to back down from protecting him because someone threatens me, then you've seriously underestimated both my determination and my capacity for making powerful people very, very sorry they crossed me." Part 8. The investigation stage. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Tyler's hospital room had been transformed
into something resembling a crime scene investigation unit. Jake Morgan had arrived with his camera crew, a sound technician, and enough recording equipment to document every aspect of Tyler's care. Lisa Brooks was there in her capacity as Tyler's nurse, but she was also serving as a medical expert who could explain the significance of his treatment to viewers who weren't familiar with intensive care protocols. Marcus Bennett had joined us as well, bringing with him copies of Tyler's medical records and the independent toxicology results that proved someone had deliberately drugged my brother. He'd also contacted Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neurosurgeon from Philadelphia, who specialized in trauma cases and who had agreed to review Tyler's scans and provide an objective assessment of his condition. But the most important addition to our team was Detective Amy Foster,
who had appeared at the hospital shortly after our confrontation with Dr. Hayes. Amy had been reinstated from administrative leave that morning when her captain realized that placing her on suspension the same day Tyler was injured looked suspiciously like retaliation for her previous cooperation with federal investigators. "Emma," Amy said, pulling me aside while Jake's crew set up their equipment, "I need you to understand what we're dealing with here. The people who hurt Tyler aren't just corrupt officials trying to cover up individual crimes. They're part of an organized network that's been operating in this county for at least 5 years." She pulled out a thick file folder and spread photographs across the small table in Tyler's room. The images showed maps of Millbrook County with red pins marking locations where suspicious incidents had occurred, organizational charts connecting various officials and business leaders, and timeline analysis that revealed patterns of criminal activity. "Amanda Parker was just the beginning," Amy continued. "We've documented 17 cases of young people who were injured, killed, or discredited after they posed threats to specific business interests or political figures. The methods vary, but the results are always the same. Potential witnesses are eliminated, and the investigations are mishandled by officials who have conflicts of interest." I studied the photographs, seeing my hometown mapped out like a battlefield where corruption had been systematically destroying anyone who threatened the established order. "How long have you been working on this?" "Since the day you reported Franklin Morrison." I realized then that his prescription scheme was just one part of a much larger operation, and I started documenting connections between various officials and business leaders who seemed to be protecting each other from accountability. She pulled out a thick file folder and spread photographs across the small table in Tyler's room. The images showed maps of Millbrook County with red pins marking locations where suspicious incidents had occurred, organizational charts connecting various officials and business leaders, and timeline analysis that revealed patterns of criminal activity. "Amanda Parker was just the beginning," Amy continued. "We've documented 17 cases of young people who were injured, killed, or discredited after they posed threats to specific business interests or political figures. The methods vary, but the results are always the same. Potential witnesses are eliminated, and the investigations are mishandled by officials who have conflicts of interest." I studied the photographs, seeing my hometown mapped out like a battlefield where corruption had been systematically destroying anyone who threatened the established order. "And Tyler was targeted because someone thought hurting him would make me leave town permanently?" "Tyler was targeted because you represent the biggest threat this network has ever faced. You proved that their protection isn't absolute when you brought down Franklin Morrison. Now they need to demonstrate that crossing them results in consequences so severe that no one will be willing to try." Jake Morgan approached us, his camera operator ready to begin recording. "Emma, we're ready to start documenting Tyler's condition and the evidence you've gathered. But I need to warn you that once this story goes live, there's no going back. These people will use every tool at their disposal to discredit you and destroy anyone who's helped you." I looked around the hospital room where my brother lay unconscious, surrounded by machines that were keeping him alive, while other machines documented every vital sign for people who wanted to use his condition as a weapon against me. 3 years ago, I'd stood in a sheriff's office and made a choice that cost me everything I thought I needed. Now, I was standing in another institutional setting, faced with another choice that would define who I was and what I was willing to sacrifice for justice. Jake, let me be very clear about something. These people have already used every tool at their disposal against my family. They drugged my brother and tried to kill him to send me a message. They're controlling his medical care to make sure he doesn't recover enough to testify against them. And they've been systematically destroying other families for years while hiding behind badges and medical degrees and judicial robes. I moved to stand beside Tyler's bed, placing my hand on his arm and feeling the warmth of life that Dr. Hayes had been convincing my parents to extinguish. If telling the truth about what happened to Tyler means that powerful people will try to destroy me, then that's a risk I'm willing to take, because the alternative is letting them win. Letting them continue hurting innocent people while we pretend that looking the other way is the same thing as keeping the peace. Jake nodded and signaled his camera operator to begin recording. This is Jake Morgan with Channel 7 Investigative News. I'm here at Millbrook General Hospital with Emma Walsh, whose 19-year-old brother Tyler was critically injured in what police have described as a drunk driving accident. However, new evidence suggests that Tyler's injuries may have been the result of a deliberate attack connected to a wider pattern of corruption in Millbrook County. For the next 2 hours, we methodically documented everything we discovered about Tyler's case and its connection to the broader conspiracy that Amy had been investigating. Marcus explained the medical evidence that proved Tyler had been deliberately drugged before his accident. Lisa described how Tyler's treatment had been mismanaged to prevent his recovery. Amy presented the pattern analysis that showed how Tyler's case fit into a larger scheme of targeted attacks against potential witnesses. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived to conduct her independent evaluation of Tyler's condition. She spent 45 minutes examining his brain scans, reviewing his medical records, and conducting neurological assessments that revealed the true state of his injuries. "This young man's brain injury is significant, but not catastrophic," she announced to Jake's cameras after completing her evaluation. "With appropriate treatment, including surgical intervention to relieve remaining pressure and aggressive rehabilitation therapy, he has an excellent chance of making a full recovery."
Recommendation to withdraw life support is not only premature, it's medically irresponsible. Dr. Vasquez turned to address the camera directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years saving lives that other doctors had given up on. The sedation levels that this patient has been receiving are inappropriate for his condition and are actively hindering his recovery. His treatment plan appears to be designed to maintain unconsciousness rather than promote healing. As a medical professional, I find this deeply disturbing. While Dr. Vasquez spoke, I noticed that Tyler's vital signs were showing subtle changes on the monitors beside his bed. His heart rate was slightly elevated, his brainwave patterns were showing more activity, and his responses to neurological stimuli were stronger than they'd been since his accident. "Lisa," I called softly, not wanting to interrupt the interview, but needing her to see what I was seeing. She moved to check Tyler's monitors, and I saw her expression change as she registered what the readings meant. "His sedation levels are decreasing," she whispered. "Dr. Hayes must have adjusted his medication after your meeting this afternoon." I felt hope bloom in my chest like a flower opening to sunlight. Tyler was starting to respond, starting to fight his way back toward consciousness despite everything that had been done to keep him under. His body was healing itself, proving that Dr. Vasquez's assessment was correct and that Dr. Hayes' recommendation to withdraw life support had been based on manufactured hopelessness rather than medical reality. "Jake," I said, getting the journalist's attention, "Tyler's condition is improving right now while we're documenting his case. His brain activity is increasing and his responses to stimuli are getting stronger." Jake's camera operator immediately focused on the monitors beside Tyler's bed, capturing the evidence that Tyler was fighting his way back to consciousness. It was the perfect visual to accompany our story, proof that aggressive treatment and proper medical care could save lives that hospital administrators had written off as hopeless. But even as I felt hope about Tyler's recovery, I was aware that we were approaching the point of no return in our war against the conspiracy that had targeted him. Once Jake's story aired on the evening news across Pennsylvania, Commissioner Garrett and his network would know that their operation had been exposed. They would either surrender and hope for lenient treatment, or they would escalate their attacks in an attempt to eliminate everyone who posed a threat to them. "Amy," I said, drawing the detective aside while Jake continued documenting Tyler's improving condition, "what kind of protection can you provide for Tyler, my parents, and the hospital staff who've been helping us?" Her expression was grim. "Officially, not much. The police department is compromised and we can't be sure which officers are trustworthy. Unofficially, I've been in contact with federal agents who are prepared to take over this investigation. They can provide protection, but only if we can give them enough evidence to justify federal intervention." "What kind of evidence do they need?" "Proof that this conspiracy crosses state lines, involves federal crimes, or targets federal officials. Tyler's case gives us attempted murder and conspiracy, but we need to connect it to interstate activities or federal jurisdiction." I thought about Franklin Morrison's prescription scheme, which had involved pharmaceutical companies and distributors across multiple states. I thought about the construction contracts that Amy had mentioned, which likely involved federal highway funds and interstate commerce. I thought about the systematic targeting of witnesses, which could be prosecuted under federal racketeering statutes. "Amy," I said, "I think we have everything we need. Franklin Morrison's operation involved interstate drug trafficking.
The construction fraud probably involves federal contracts and funds, and the pattern of witness intimidation constitutes organized criminal activity under RICO statutes. She nodded slowly. You're right. And with Tyler's case as the catalyst, we can tie everything together into a federal conspiracy case that will give us the jurisdiction and resources we need to take down the entire network. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with a call from Agent Martinez at the FBI field office in Pittsburgh. I answered, putting the call on speaker so Amy could hear both sides of the conversation. Miss Walsh, I've been monitoring the situation in Millbrook County, and I want you to know that we're prepared to move forward with federal arrests as soon as tonight. However, I need to warn you that the subjects of our investigation are likely to take desperate measures once they realize their operation has been exposed. What kind of desperate measures? They may attempt to eliminate evidence, including witnesses who can testify against them. Your brother's improving condition makes him a priority target, and your public accusations make you a target as well. We're prepared to provide federal protection, but you need to be ready to accept it immediately when we make our move. I looked around Tyler's hospital room at the people who had risked their careers and their safety to help my family seek justice. Marcus, who had defied hospital authority to run unauthorized medical tests. Lisa, who had documented evidence of malpractice despite threats to her job. Amy, who had spent years building a case against corruption while being systematically undermined by her own department. Jake, who was preparing to broadcast a story that would make him a target for retaliation. Agent Martinez, I said, we're ready. Tyler's life is worth any risk we have to take, and the people of Millbrook County deserve better than the corrupt system that's been controlling their lives for years. Then we'll see you tonight, and, Ms. Walsh, what you've done here, exposing this conspiracy and fighting for your brother's life, it's going to make a difference for a lot of families who thought they had no hope for justice. Part 9. The initial confrontation. The confrontation I'd been dreading came at 6:47 p.m., just as Jake Morgan's investigative report was beginning to air on the evening news across Pennsylvania. I was sitting beside Tyler's bed, watching his brain activity strengthen on the monitors, when Commissioner Frank Garrett walked into the room like he owned not just the hospital, but everything and everyone in it. Garrett was a man who commanded attention without saying a word, built like the college football player he'd once been, with silver hair and a uniform decorated with commendations from 30 years in law enforcement. He'd been the face of justice in Millbrook County for so long that most people had forgotten there had ever been anyone else in charge. When he spoke, city council members listened. When he made recommendations, judges followed them.
When he assured families that investigations were being handled properly, they trusted him completely. But I'd learned to see past the facade of authority and competence, to recognize the calculating intelligence behind his public persona. Garrett wasn't just corrupt, he was brilliant at corruption, sophisticated enough to build a network that had operated for years without detection, and ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who threatened its existence. Commissioner Garrett, he said, his voice carrying the kind of measured authority that made people stand straighter and pay attention. I think it's time we had a conversation. My parents were in the hallway speaking with Dr. Vasquez about Tyler's treatment plan, and Marcus had gone to check on other patients. Lisa was at the nurse's station, but I could see her watching our room with the kind of alert tension that meant she was ready to call for help if needed. Amy was somewhere in the hospital, coordinating with federal agents who were preparing to move against the entire conspiracy network. Commissioner Garrett, I replied, not bothering to stand or show any deference to his position. I assume you're here about the news report that's currently exposing your operation to the entire state. He moved farther into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The sound of it clicking shut felt ominous, like the closing of a trap that had been months in the making. I'm here because you've made some serious accusations against good people, and those accusations are going to have consequences that reach far beyond your family. The only consequences I'm worried about are the ones that Tyler's attackers are going to face when they're arrested and prosecuted for attempted murder. Garrett approached Tyler's bed, looking down at my unconscious brother with an expression that might have been sympathy if I hadn't known better. Tyler's a good kid. It's a shame he got caught up in something that didn't concern him. But that's what happens when people make choices that put their families at risk. The threat was clear, but it was delivered with the kind of casual authority that Garrett had been using to intimidate people for decades.
He expected me to back down, to choose protecting Tyler over pursuing justice, to accept that some battles couldn't be won by ordinary people against entrenched power. "Commissioner, let me explain something to you," I said, standing up to face him directly. "3 years ago, you and your friends made the mistake of thinking that destroying my reputation and driving me out of town would end the threat I posed to your operations. But what you actually did was teach me that corrupt officials like you are cowards who only have power as long as people are afraid to challenge them." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been uncertainty. "Emma, you're a smart woman, smart enough to understand that there are consequences for people who interfere with matters that are bigger than they are. Your brother's accident was unfortunate, but accidents happen to people who don't pay attention to their surroundings. Tyler's accident was attempted murder, and the evidence proving it is already in the hands of federal investigators. Your network of protection is about to collapse, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." "Is that what you think?" Garrett moved closer, using his height and physical presence to try to intimidate me. "You think a few medical records and some testimony from disgruntled hospital employees is going to bring down people who've been protecting this community for decades? I think a federal RICO investigation involving prescription drug trafficking, construction fraud, witness intimidation, and attempted murder is going to bring down everyone involved in your conspiracy, including you." For the first time since entering the room, Garrett's mask of confident authority slipped slightly. He'd been prepared for grief-stricken parents who would accept explanations about tragic accidents. He'd been prepared for local officials who could be pressured or bought or threatened into compliance. But he hadn't been prepared for federal jurisdiction and evidence that couldn't be suppressed through local connections. "Commissioner, let me explain something to you," I said, standing up to face him directly. 3 years ago, you and your friends made the mistake of thinking that destroying my reputation and driving me out of town would end the threat I posed to your operations. But what you actually did was teach me that corrupt officials like you are cowards, who only have power as long as people are afraid to challenge them." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been uncertainty. "What do you want, Emma?" "I want justice for Tyler and for every other victim of your network. I want accountability for people who've used their positions of authority to protect criminals and silence witnesses. And I want to make sure that what happened to my family never happens to anyone else in this county. And if I told you that cooperation might result in better outcomes for everyone involved?" I almost laughed at the suggestion. "Commissioner, you're not in a position to negotiate anymore. Federal agents are already moving against your network, and by tomorrow morning, most of your associates
Will be in custody facing federal charges. The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or difficult for yourself." The door to Tyler's room opened, and Amy Foster stepped inside with 2 men in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Garrett turned to face them, and I saw his expression change as he realized that the conversation he'd hoped to have with me was over. "Commissioner Garrett," one of the agents said, producing a badge and identification, "I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI. You're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of civil rights under color of authority." The next few minutes unfolded with the kind of surreal efficiency that marked the end of criminal enterprises. Garrett was read his rights and handcuffed while maintaining the dignity and composure that had served him throughout his career. He didn't protest or argue or claim innocence. He simply accepted that his 30-year reign over Millbrook County had finally come to an end. As the agents escorted him from the room, Garrett paused at the door and looked back at me. "Emma, you have no idea what you've started. The people you're going after have connections that reach places you can't imagine, and they don't forgive threats to their operations." "Then they're going to learn the same lesson you just learned," I replied. "Some people can't be intimidated into silence, and some fights are worth having regardless of the consequences." After they left, Amy remained behind to brief me on what was happening throughout Millbrook County.
Simultaneous arrests are taking place at 17 locations. Dr. Hayes was taken into custody at her home 20 minutes ago. Judge Thompson was arrested at his country club. Deputy Harrison was picked up during a traffic stop. We've also raided the offices of 6 businesses that were involved in money laundering and fraud schemes. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion as the scope of the operation became clear. For years, these people had operated with impunity, convinced that their network of protection was unbreakable. Now they were discovering that federal law enforcement didn't respect local connections or small-town loyalties. What about Tyler's medical care? I asked. With Dr. Hayes under arrest, who's going to be making decisions about his treatment? Dr. Vasquez has been granted temporary authority over Tyler's case, and the hospital board has approved aggressive treatment protocols. She's recommending surgery tomorrow morning to address remaining pressure points, followed by intensive rehabilitation therapy. I looked at my brother, still unconscious, but showing stronger signs of neurological activity with each passing hour. The sedatives that Dr. Hayes had used to keep him under were wearing off, and his natural healing processes were finally being allowed to function without interference. Amy, I need to ask you something. Are we safe now? My parents, Tyler, the hospital staff who helped us, are we protected from retaliation? Her expression was serious, but confident. The federal protective detail will remain in place until we're certain that all members of the network have been identified and arrested. But Emma, you need to understand that this investigation is going to continue for months. You'll be a key witness in multiple prosecutions, and that means your life is going to be under scrutiny for a long time. I thought about the implications of what she was telling me. Months of legal proceedings, testimony that would relive Tyler's attack and the conspiracy that had targeted our family. Media attention that would make privacy impossible. It was the price of seeking justice, the cost of refusing to let powerful people escape accountability for their crimes. It's worth it, I said simply. Tyler's life is worth it, and so are the lives of everyone else who's been hurt by these people.